Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, for those who don't know you, what are your credentials in science?
My undergraduate is in molecular biology and bioinformatics, which is a mouthful of a term just meaning studying life at the smallest details. So DNA, RNA, protein, kind of the basic machinery of a cell. And bioinformatics is the application of computers to study all that, just because there's untold amounts of information now that would be impossible for us to manually review step by step by hand. And then for graduate school, I went to Harvard, did my PhD in I guess it fell into the category of cell and developmental biology. It was on adult stem cell research. My interest going to Harvard was in cancer research. This was 2003. And at that time, the connection between cancer and stem cells was just getting hot and growing. And so, in my mind, one of the key questions was if we don't know how cells go awry in cancer, then maybe we should understand how they function normally if there is this link between stem cells and cancer. And if we understand the normal process, we can better understand how things go amiss. So that was my work. We didn't discover anything earth-shattering, but really interesting process nonetheless. And for the last 15 years, I've been working on creation evolution research with the Institute for Creation Research for the first 6 years, and then the last, or first 5.5 years, whatever it was, last 10 years, then with Answers in Genesis.
And I think when we were talking before, you'd mentioned a particular interest in the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. What was the
Yes,
connection there?
the Dana-Farber is affiliated with Harvard, and that was one of my interests in going there. And I remember taking a trip out the summer before I started the program to check out housing, and I thought maybe I can meet up with one of the professors while I was there. You get a big fat book of professors whose labs you can go in. It's almost overwhelming, the sheer volume. And when I talked to this guy, he said something like, "So you want to work in cancer research?" Yes. He's like, "Great. There's 10,000 people or some astronomical number working on cancer research." I thought, "Oh, good grief." So uh, eventually found a lab though I could join and thrive in and learn a lot in, and learned a lot by trial and error with a heavy emphasis on the error. But I feel like I came out the better for it and much better equipped to do independent research and find questions and tackle them in a very efficient, clever way.
And behind you, I see the cover for your book, Replacing Darwin. Walk us through maybe a little bit of what advances we've had in technology for understanding things like genes, evolution since Darwin.
I'd say it's worlds apart, and it's been interesting for me just to learn how little was known. So just to put things on a timeline, Darwin publishes his first edition of On the Origin of Species in 1859. Gregor Mendel's work, which is where most modern genetics textbooks begin, he's working with pea plants and crossing them and trying to figure out even the most basic elements of genetics. No understanding of DNA, just how do traits get inherited? How do they change? Basic principles. That postdates Darwin. So Darwin has no idea even about that because it hasn't been discovered yet. And genetics really is at the core of this question of the origin of species for a number of reasons. We can say now, retrospectively, uh, for one, the question of who are species related to, which is really where the rub is very heavily. There's other questions related to that, the origin of species, like how do they form, when do they form, which are important, but what tends to get the press and where things get dicey, of course, is, for example, are humans related to primates? Are we related to chimpanzees, great apes, and so on? And that's an ancestry question. And the only direct scientific record of that is genetics. You can look at clues like anatomical comparisons, physiological comparisons, but these ultimately are built by, in the process of development, the instructions encoded in DNA. So if you really want to know questions of ancestry, and really even the questions of how do species form, if you want to produce something new by definition, a new species, which I think by most criteria would have to look different. It have to have something different about it, have to be isolated, have to have a population, all that. But to produce something different, you have to change the DNA. Basic, and I say by definition because you can get temporary changes, you can get physiological changes. People in Tibet can, I think, they may have a genetic difference, but there's also, if we go up to high altitude, our bodies will react normally and adjust to high altitude, lower oxygen, and so forth. There's epigenetic changes, which is sort of right next to genetics is the definition of that term. But to make something permanent, which is what you need to get a new species. It can't just be sort of a flash in the pan that fades back to its original form. It has to be, oh look, there's a creature with black and white stripes. It's a zebra. That it has to originate at some point and look different from its ancestors. You have to change the DNA. So this is at the core of the entire origin of species question, and to extend that timeline. So Mendel's work, which again don't even know DNA, is after Darwin. I think the 1860s, if I'm not mistaken. Then, so Darwin dies, what is it, 1882. For the next 100 years after the origin of species, 1859 to about, and I should remember this date, I don't know if it's 1959, but Watson and Crick, when they published their paper, what I learned, again, retrospectively, about how the field advanced from Darwin up to that point, there was a very significant debate as to what exactly encoded the information for a species. Where does the genetic information lie? And proteins, actually, a different type of molecule at the cellular level, keratin in our hair and such, and its skin, or that's protein. People thought proteins were where the information for inheritance was encoded, and it wasn't until Watson and Crick really solved the structure of DNA where the pieces kind of came together. Like, aha, okay, uh, this is how DNA could function as a molecule of inheritance. This is how it gets, well, eventually replicated, they found out, or people after them. And it solved a bunch of questions that were outstanding. So it's a century after Darwin before we finally figure out it's DNA that's the substance of heredity. And of course, it's taken even more decades after that to figure out the DNA sequences of lots of species. Let's think of humans for an example. We have the vast majority of our DNA encoded in the nucleus. This is what would be called autosomal DNA. You take an ancestry DNA test or family tree DNA, 23andMe, one of these popular genetic testing companies, and they're testing your autosomal DNA. That's something very new. 1981, the scientific community first discovered the sequence of mitochondrial DNA, which is just this tiny little piece of our total DNA. And eventually in the 80s and such, the community developed a plan to say, how do we attack and solve the question of the entire human DNA sequence? And they laid out a series of stepping stones, basically. Let's start with simpler creatures, yeast, roundworms, fruit flies, mice, getting progressively more complex to be able to work out some of the technical details of how do we do this when we've got this massive set of DNA for humans, and then figure out what it means. So 2001 was the big announcement of the human DNA sequence, which that's not that long ago, but is very long after Darwin. So even basic questions like that, of course, he didn't touch the origin of humans and origin of species. He waited a little over a decade to publish The Descent of Man, but still he's arguing for common ancestry among all living things, and has no tools in terms of genetic tools, DNA tools. No one has any tools to address this directly for about a century and a half thereafter. So you could argue, I argue in the book Replacing Darwin, he takes a gigantic risk. He argues forcefully for a conclusion without the direct scientific tools to test it. They wouldn't come from his perspective in the distant future.
Mhm. And let's take it back. So Mendel, about peers in terms of time. And what is Mendel doing? What is he finding around the same time as Darwin?
He's finding just the basic principles of dominance, recessive, for example. That would be a basic genetic principle. I think it's white flowers and pink flowers, and so which one shows up? You've got pea seeds. Are they wrinkled? Are they smooth? There's a number of different traits. He's discovering these principles simply by keeping good notes, good bookkeeping. Lots of
Mhm.
plants, big statistical sample size, and very carefully tracking which particular traits change with time, the frequencies with which they appear, statistical numbers, these sorts of things. And some scientists have speculated retrospectively, because there are weird things that happen in genetics that violate some of the rules he's talked about, that did he just get lucky that he happened to pick some traits that did follow these particular principles? But these sorts of things laid the foundation then on which we could try to uncover a mechanism. So, okay, what is it? Which molecule could help explain why certain things are dominant or recessive, or inherited in this sort of way, or independent assortment of traits would be another principle where, and actually I can explain it with more modern terms here. DNA is packaged in a sense, or found in our cells in discrete units. So we've got 3.259, whatever it is, billion letters in our DNA, in our genome. And it's not just one long, basically molecular string. It's broken into 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. And those chromosomes are basically physical links between subsets of DNA, which are, we call them genes, encoding for particular proteins, which encode for particular traits and so forth. It's more complicated than that, but that's a good starting point. And I think Mendel happened to pick traits that in the pea plant were found on different chromosomes, and so they could be shuffled from generation to generation fairly easily. We now know if you've got traits encoded on the same chromosome, they can be linked together physically, and so therefore kind of inherited together from generation to generation, which would have, of course, complicated his statistics and some of his discoveries, but history is the way it played out. And so he found these principles, and that really got the ball rolling in terms of helping us understand what we now know about modern genetics.
And for those of us who haven't had that biology lesson in a while, the pea plant experiment, what did that look like?
He's crossing different plants. He's crossing again. There's they have different types of flowers. I think pink versus white. It's going to be different types of seeds, smooth cover, which I think is most of what we buy in the store, and then wrinkled seeds. And I'm forgetting some of the other traits, but he's simply deliberately crossing different plants with different traits, keeping down in his notebook how many plants of this frequency, and when I cross these two, what's the frequency of these traits? So with dominance and recessive, Punnett squares is how we'd kind of diagram it now. Like a little a, little a, big B, little b. And then if you kind of work out the Punnett square, where if you have a capital letter, capital A or capital B, it's going to be, uh, or even if you just do, let me just use a simpler example. If it's capital A, lowercase a, capital A, lowercase a, basically a plant, let's say, that has, and I don't remember which was dominant in his particular experiments, but let's say pink flowers is dominant, white is recessive, and he's got plants where we would say genetically they're capital A, lowercase a, they're still pink though, because pink is dominant. I'm just saying in my example, and then capital A, lowercase a, the other plant, you do your Punnett square, and the frequency of two lowercase a's together is 1 and 4. Anyway, that's sort of that dominant recessive principle. Blue eyes in humans kind of follows that same pattern. I mean, one of many eye colors, but these are the types of things that come out of his experiments.
And these are the types of things that we all maybe take for granted now, but you're saying Darwin was not exposed to this information, correct?
It's not even in existence when he publishes on the
Mm,
origin of species.
yeah.
So he's really jumping into the large void of, okay, I think, so he's saying, of course, in his book, I think species all have a common ancestor. I think they evolved by natural selection, but explaining how, yes, natural selection is survival of the fittest to reproduce, but being able to mechanistically explain step by step, how exactly does that work? He's got no genetic knowledge. No one does at that time at their disposal to be able to figure out how that might occur and test the plausibility of it. So just to zoom ahead then, I guess in the history a little bit, to Michael Behe's work with Darwin's Black Box. He's part of the intelligent design community, published his book, I think it was 1996. And he takes Darwin's sentence, because Darwin gave a test of evolution on the origin of species in 1859. In Darwin's quote, it's a mouthful of a Victorian sentence, but it goes something like, if it could be demonstrated that uh, basically any organ, any species, any piece of a creature, because he's trying to explain everything in life. If you can show that anything could not be built by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. In other words, evolution doesn't happen by miracles. Evolutionists today would say birds evolved from dinosaurs, but they would not say that it happened by, let's say, a Tyrannosaurus rex or some other dinosaur laying an egg and out popping a bald eagle. That would be a big leap, basically a miracle. It has to go step by tiny step, where scales or whatever the dinosaurs had very almost imperceptibly change over long periods of time to something like proto feathers, then more mature feathers, and so on. And Michael Behe's point was, we now have tools, genetic tools. He was looking primarily at biochemistry, where we can kind of pull back the curtain and look into the microscope and see exactly what has to happen step by tiny step for certain things to evolve. And his point was, we now know there's biochemical processes. You can even make the argument from DNA where there's mutually interdependent components where you remove one component by definition and the whole system collapses. You can't build that step by tiny step. You have to build it all at once, or there's nothing for nature to select, basically, to evolve it. So there's things that it is impossible for Darwinian evolution to explain. These are the sorts of things, these are the sorts of discussions Darwin could not have had in 1859 because there's no consensus on genetics. There's really no knowledge of genetics at that time, let alone biochemistry. And so that adds to the risk he's taking by going out and staking his claim. This is how it happened, even though he's missing some of the most important clues by which to evaluate his ideas.
And another component of that, as you mentioned before, the double helix. What is missing in terms of an argument for Darwin without knowing the double helix, genes, that sort of thing?
I'd say there's a whole bunch of things missing. There's, I mean, kudos to Darwin for saying here's a test of my ideas because that's the court definition. And I'd say that the standard definition of science is defined by testability. You have to have some claim that future experiments could show to be true or false, which he did put that in print, and we may not have been able to evaluate that very well for 150 years, at least in a very precise, rigorous way. I mean, you could make some sort of indirect arguments back in his day. For example, sexual reproduction. You need male and female in the most basic, simplest terms without going into the nitty-gritty detail, the biochemistry of sperm, biochemistry of egg, lock and key, all that sort of stuff. Just you have to have both there for sexual reproduction to exist. So how do you evolve that step by step unless you have both male and female from the start? I think you could have made that argument back then. Nonetheless, we can make better ones now. And in terms of, so let's take one of his central claims, the universal common ancestry of all of life. Everything's related. People are related to bacteria, to monkeys, to mammals, to turtles, everything. Fruit flies, all these are our relatives. In his day, you could use anatomy and physiology, comparative anatomy and physiology, to say, okay, which species of animals are closest anatomically, physiologically, and maybe even developmentally, looking at embryology and such, and development in the womb. And that was actually one of the early arguments. Uh, Phylogeny, or anyway, that development recapitulates evolution was one of the early arguments. So you could make indirect arguments, is my point, with those types of fields trying to argue for evolutions. And really the logic goes like this, and still exists to this day. The addition of genetics to this discussion for the evolutionary side, it has simply added another example of old logic, and the logic being, let's take the human forelimb. We've got a certain number of bones here here, so my shoulder. I'm wearing a dark shirt, but shoulder down here to this part of my arm, and then so bone here, two bones here. You got wrist bones, and then digits. Anyway, there's a similar anatomical pattern that you can find in whales, in other mammals, in reptiles, in amphibians, and so on. And the evolutionary logic is, again, not all of these. Obviously, this does not look like a whale flipper, but the underlying anatomical structure, there's obvious parallels to the whale flipper. And the evolutionary question then is, how do you explain the similarities and differences? And the evolutionary argument is descent with modification, common ancestry and natural selection, that the common pattern of one bone, two bones, wrist bones, digits exists and is in common among these species because they must have all evolved from common ancestor. And the differences that exist must be the product of natural selection, adaptation to specific environments, and so on. That's the basic logic back then. And then that same logic applies when comparing DNA sequences among species. Why do we have a gene for, let's say, eye development that we might find in fruit flies? Oh, well, because we have a common ancestor. The DNA sequences for our particular eye development gene are not identical to the fruit fly eye development gene, but they function similarly as best as we can tell. This is one of their textbook arguments. And any DNA differences, again, is natural selection over time. So these are the sorts of arguments they make. I would say the weakness of the evolutionary argument from Darwin until now has been the same, namely, uh, what is the counter explanation? In a sense, any sort of scientific debate is a process of elimination. You can never
Mm.
definitively prove your idea. You have to eliminate the competing hypotheses. In Darwin's day, there was sort of an archaic, outdated, almost caricature of creation science and an underdeveloped sense of what does design predict. And so, to make a long story short, and I would say as a young Earth creationist, the first chapter of Genesis does not give us all the details of how God designed. It doesn't tell us exactly what principles he employed, but it does say God made man in his own image. There's something about humans, the Bible says, that reflects something about God. And so therefore, if we look to how humans design things, and this is actually something I've drawn on from the intelligent design community. They've done a tremendous job, even helped me think kind of like an engineer, because that applies here. How do humans design things? We design things in homologous ways. So the technical form then of the evolutionary argument about my forearm and so forth is what's called homology. Homo being same, Homo sapiens, homosexual. Ology, of course, the study of. So homology, the study of similarity or sameness. Uh, Human engineers design things in homologous patterns. You can look at car manufacturers in Asia, North America, and South America, and Europe, and there's a basic set of designs we all employ, not because cars evolved from some ancestral design in the Arctic and it evolved over time. It's simply four wheels functions better than five or three, and four doors or better than five doors. It's sloping windshield. There's just basic design things, physics that influence how cars, vehicles, planes function, and it has nothing to do with evolution. So the key question then for evolution back then and now, and I'll get back to genetics here in a minute, because this is kind of the foundation for all that. The key question back then is, sure, evolution might predict via descent with modification this sort of common pattern that's slightly different among various species. But so does design. Human engineers design things in homologous ways. So I could argue that the similarity of my forelimb to a whale, to a frog, is equally strong evidence of design. Long story short, if you're in a court case and you're trying to convict a suspect and you present evidence that fingers a particular suspect, that might sound persuasive until someone comes along and says, "Oh no, he was framed," or there's some counter explanation. And so long as you have two competing hypotheses that explain something equally well, you can't eliminate either of them, and it's all a wash. So uh, that's in a sense part of how the debate has played out since 1859. I would say that the relevance of genetics and all this, there's the evolutionary relevance, and then there's the wider debate relevance. So for the evolutionists, again, it's simply one more discipline in which to make the same arguments, like homology. I would say it's also another form of, again, that same pointless debate. So the same things I just mentioned about anatomy and physiology, it's homologous things in anatomy and physiology, homologous structures or sequences in DNA. That same sort of design versus common ancestry debate applies. But where DNA takes us even further is to show, like Michael Behe has done, that there's certain things you cannot evolve step by tiny step. So maybe to reorganize what I've just said, there's questions of probability. Does the evidence look like evolution's true? And then there's plausibility. Can evolution be true? And so this debate, probability, what does the evidence look like, has been going on for 150 years, and the evolutionary arguments really haven't changed much. And what I try to argue in replacing Darwin is pretty much all the textbook arguments for evolution are a form of they say it supports evolution, but design explains it equally well, and so you can't conclude anything. In terms of the probability side, I feel like there's been big advances as we've better understood how cells operate, how DNA and RNA and protein operate, how life operates. And there's now an ever-growing list of examples of things you cannot evolve naturalistically step by tiny steps. So evolution is therefore, by Darwin's own standard, impossible. Now, if evolutionists want to invoke some sort of miracle, fine. That's not Darwinian evolution. And then you have to ask the question, what's the statistical probability of some freak accident happening? And if you're not just going to attribute it to nature, but you invoke some sort of purpose or plan, now that's beginning to kind of to move towards creation ideas, and it's an abandonment of Darwin. So that's one element. And actually, just to add one more point here, maybe on the probability side, and this is work I've done over the last 15 years, there are increasing lines of evidence in genetics where it's not a form of evolution predicts this, oh, we predict the same thing. It's evolution predicts this or creation predicts this, and evolution predicts something completely different. And you can do a good head-to-head comparison. And this is so some of the research in particular I've done is looking at rates of DNA change, where based on my views on young Earth creation, you can make specific, precise predictions as to how fast or slow DNA should change in various species. Evolution is going to predict something very different because it has a very different time scale. And there we've seen, I think, strong confirmation of the young Earth time scale and rejection of the evolutionary one. So I'd say there's multiple categories to which the DNA evidence applies. There's probability ones that are kind of old, new forms of old arguments. There's plausibility questions. Can evolution happen? And then I'd say in the last 15 years, there's whole new arguments on the probability side of it's not just anti-evolutionary evidence, it's evidence that contradicts evolution and strongly confirms the prediction of young Earth creation. And that represents a whole new era, a whole new phase of the creation evolution debate. And there's a long legal backstory to that too. But that's, I think, some of the freshest aspects of all this and has the biggest potential to dramatically rewrite how this is playing out in our society.
Hmm. And Dr. Jeanson, I think you said something like, certain trait changes would take a miracle. The logic that I've heard is that it would happen really incrementally out of need or out of finding an advantage. So let's say an animal finds that being able to spot something in the distance is more valuable, and so it slowly becomes upright. Over time, and these are really minor changes, and it takes many generations to make the change. That seems persuasive. What's the need for a miracle?
Yes, so I'd say the test of Darwin's own test, and then the Michael Behe counter to that, has very specific applications. And Behe himself will say this is not an argument against natural selection. Yes, natural selection can happen, survival of the fittest reproduce, adaptation happens, all that. The test for Darwin is, are there specific exceptions? And Behe's point is, by definition, the exception and really the refutation of Darwin's idea would be something where you cannot evolve step by tiny steps. So let's think about that process then of, walking upright. Are there mutually interdependent parts in the physiology, the anatomy, the development of walking upright that would make it difficult? So what I'm getting at is Behe's definition of irreducible complexity is there's complexity in life, but some of it is reducible, where not all the parts are necessary. You can remove something and it functions just fine, and that's not a problem for evolution. That would be plausible to evolve at step by tiny step. His point is there are certain things like his example is the blood clotting cascade, biochemical cascade, where you've got a whole bunch of different components that all have to interact and sequence, where you remove one component and maybe it's lethal, you'll bleed out, or the system doesn't function. And so you can't evolve that. And his point is for natural selection to evolve that, which is you have to have some sort of advantage or function to select for. In this case, presumably the function is being able to clot your blood and not bleed out. Well, if you can't actually do that until you've got 8, 9, 10, or whatever it is, components as part of the system, you're just going to bleed out until all 10 components are in place. And so what is there to select for? How can evolution make sure piece number 1, piece number 2, piece number 3, all these keep going in the right direction if there is no function to select for until all 8 are in place? So that was his point, and then he gave multiple examples of here's irreducibly complex structures. And again, irreducible meaning, and there may be components of the blood clotting cascade where Yeah, you can pull out this piece, nothing happens. Pull out this piece, that means it's still at a reducible stage of complexity. But irreducible is when you've stripped it down to its absolutely essential components, without which the system doesn't function. And his point is, how can you evolve each of those components step by tiny step if there is no function until all the pieces are in place? And so that's his counter. Again, fully acknowledges there's stuff that's reducible in terms of its complexity. That's not a barrier to evolution. But the things that are irreducible, mutually interdependent, interacting parts, remove one and the system collapses. That seems impossible to evolve because you can't build it step by tiny step because, again, just the nature of the system.
Hearing you talk about this is making me wonder, one, were people talking about this sort of thing at Harvard? And then two, assuming no, how did you end up in this career track? We had talked a little bit before we started about your career choices.
Yes, I'll answer the first one, then you might have to remind me of the second one because there's a really interesting answer
Okay.
that I just discovered last year along these lines. So, no, no one's discussing it at Harvard, but I realize in a sense why. And let me bring in some data from a left field a bit, but then it'll become relevant here in a minute. One of the key questions journalists will ask me, or we have to deal with basically as creationists here at Answers in Genesis, is the statistics in evolution. So 99% of PhD scientists hold to evolution. This is Pew Forum surveys. Uh, these sorts of data, though, I think have been consistent for quite some time. This isn't any sort of surprise. And of course, the question is, if creationists are correct, if Michael Behe is correct, for example, I don't know that he'd call himself a creationist as much as he's not an evolutionist in that sense. Why does 99% of the scientific community disagree with him? And these are smart people. They're not dumb. Uh, and it seems at first pass like there's no good answers to that. And that kind of relates to, I think, to your original question of if they aren't discussing it, why not? Uh, and the options that have been on the table for some time have been either something wild like, we don't actually believe in science, which is foolish, or maybe there's some vast conspiracy to suppress it, that they actually all know what the answer is, but they get together and say, shh, let's not talk about it, which of course seems equally ridiculous. The third answer I discovered last year was running some numbers, some statistics on enrollment. So in this case, what I did was I think it's the National Center for Education Statistics. It's some government database basically that keeps track of enrollment in colleges. I looked at undergraduate rather than graduate just because there's more. So you have better statistical sample size for undergraduate students. And I think in 2021 or so, whatever year I was looking at, about 15 million undergraduates in the United States. Answers in Genesis keeps a list of people or schools that are like-minded. We have a yearly college expo, invite people who are or colleges that are young Earth creationists, uh, come have a booth, and so then our supporters can come out and because they have to think about college and help them along in their decision process. Anyway, it's not a long list. And I also added to that list some other schools that aren't necessarily evolutionary. So Loma Linda, I don't think is on that list. They're a Seventh-day Adventist school. I think they would say Earth is young, universe is old, something like that. Hillsdale, I'm not sure they would call themselves creationist as much as maybe intelligent design. Anyway, there's a handful of other dissenting schools. It's not a big list still. So I took enrollment numbers for those schools and then ran the percentages. And the remarkable result was 99% of all undergraduates in the United States go to schools where all they will ever hear is evolution. The enrollment numbers perfectly predict PhD profession. Basically, evolution in, evolution out. That's the math of it. It implies a very unflattering conclusion, namely that PhDs simply hold to what they're taught, as if they don't think for it on themselves. But I think this is actually a very robust conclusion that can be well supported. And my primary justification is via asking another question. We can say, well, why do 99% of students hear only evolution? And the answer to that is court decisions from the 1980s. Specifically, if we back up one more decade to the 1970s, 70s was a real wave of enthusiasm for creation science, lots of debates in college campuses, thousands of students coming out. First real, I think, exposure to many people and real maturation of the creation view of presenting a scientific case. And I think the evolutionists themselves would admit we were unprepared. for these sorts of debates. We thought this guy was going to get up and quote Bible verses, and instead he lambasted us with scientific evidence. And so we had to kind of get our act together after that. All that to say, that produced interest among the general populace for equal time measures, putting creation science in the public schools. And at least two states did that, Louisiana and Arkansas. There was a 1982 federal court decision that overturned the Arkansas law that mandated equal time for creation science. And in 87, the Supreme Court overturned the Louisiana law, again, an equal time measure. Again, during none of these decades was evolution ever out of the curriculum. It was simply creation taught alongside it. And I think it's valuable to ask the question, what's the harm in that? And really, I'm in a sense asking the question hypothetically of my opponents, saying, what's the big deal? Why did you fight to kick creation science out of the classroom? Evolution's taught. And if evolution is just so persuasive that any thinking person will buy into it, there should be no need to oppose this, right? And I think the answer to my hypothetical question is my opponents must believe more than I do that students will end up believing whatever they're taught. That's why they fought so hard to kick creation science out, even though evolution was in the whole time, because they were concerned that students would end up as creationists if that's what they were taught. So, no, it's not discussed at Harvard, but I think that's ultimately a product of the education system where my opponents have been wildly successfully legally in keeping creation science out of any education. Again, 99% of students are going to schools where they never hear anything about it. And in my own anecdotal experience, when I bring up creation science evidence, and let me give one example here that's a bit closer to home, sort of maybe one of the best case scenarios. And let me pause here and bring in another group of people. So theistic evolutionists, those who would say, yes, I'm a Christian, but I think God used evolution to create the world. You'd think they'd be more familiar with the creationist position because they would be professing believers like me. But my experience with them has been, this is one anecdote then, because I was supposed to debate a theistic evolutionist from BioLogos. That's one of the better known theistic evolutionary organizations. Francis Collins founded it. He was the former head of the NIH, National Institutes of Health. Daryl Falk was going to debate me at a Christian conference. It was, I think, the Evangelical Theological Society. Anyway, one of his conditions for debating was to meet me ahead of time. We had 4-hour discussion just to get to know each other over lunch and so on at my office. And very cordial, very friendly until about the last half hour when we started discussing science. And my takeaway, because it almost was hostile once I started presenting a scientific case for my view. And this is not a criticism of Daryl Falk as much as it was a reaction that to me was consistent with him never being exposed to it. So what I'm getting at is I've had visceral reactions to things in my life. Usually it's something I take for granted that gets challenged that I've never had to defend, and I don't know how to defend because I'm caught off guard, and it's just, what do I do? That was kind of his reaction, which again, to me, it was not, it was nothing rude or bad as much as I'm like, he's reacting like someone who's never known that creation scientists, young earth creation scientists, present a scientific case for their view. How can that be? I'm like, this guy is a professing Christian. He's going to debate me, has agreed to it. You'd think he'd research the opponent's position. And again, this is not a blasting him for not doing homework as much as I'm like, you'd think he of all people would know this is how creationists present their view. Yet even he, and so my argument is kind of from the lesser to the greater, or greater to the lesser. This guy of all people should know what creationists hold to. And if he didn't, how much more so the vast majority of the scientific community that isn't even professing Christian. Same surveys show that 60% of scientists don't even profess belief in some sort of vague God. The options on the survey were, are you an atheist, basically? Do you believe in a higher power? And then some sort of God. It doesn't have to be a Christian God. And 60% couldn't even affirm the belief in God part. So fairly secular, I'd say, nature of the scientific community. Yet here's a guy who's a professing Christian and has a visceral reaction to the discovery, apparently, that young earth creationists will advance scientific arguments for their cause. So all that, I think, is helpful context for why it's not discussed at Harvard. I would say my enemies have done a very good job of marginalizing creation science, making sure no one ever gets exposed to it. And my experience has been that's exactly true. Because when I do expose people to it, it's like they've never heard of it before and they don't know what to do. Now, we had a debate, and I think he was more prepared and all that. And this is, again, he's a smart guy and he was easy to get along with. But I was surprised how surprised he was, basically, at essentially discovering what I hold to. And I thought this would have been pretty standard stuff, yet he's gone through the same mainstream education system. And so I think all that's a part. Now you had a second question.
Yeah. So the second part is you come through this education system, and I mean at one of the great institutions, Harvard, and you have a doctorate. And yet from that system, you take this career track. What was happening in you to point you in that direction?
Yeah, and maybe we can add a second question, which is, yeah, how do you stay a creationist? So if my
Yeah,
enemies have
yeah,
done
that's
such
a
a
good
good
one
job,
too.
yes, my enemies have done such a good job basically marginalizing creation science, how does one go through it? So I would say, in a sense, I'm one of those exceptions to that statistic, or maybe I would be the 1%. Not that I went to Christian college. I was giving you statistics for undergraduate college, university education. But my upbringing was homeschool through eighth grade. I went to Ken Ham. He's our CEO. Went to Ken Ham lectures as a kid, creationist lectures as a kid, read creationist books. The high school I went to was a small Christian high school in Wisconsin. The curriculum was young earth creation based. What I've found in my upbringing was the creationist materials, lectures, whole system of instruction was one in which students like myself were taught not just creation science, but also evolution. The thinking, I think, being if you're going to want to stand your ground, you better know what your opponents say, or you're going to be useless in terms of trying to figure out things on your own. Uh, I feel like that's just kind of debate 101. Everyone knows you're entering a highly debated topic, so make sure you know what the positions say. And I did. And when I went to University of Wisconsin Parkside was my undergraduate, not a Christian school, not a creationist school, and so evolution's taught. But I don't I don't recall anything being surprising. That's not a I'm a smart person as much as I was taught the other side and taught it well, and there was little of anything that caught me off guard or produced a visceral reaction, as if I'd taken it for granted. Oh no, now what am I going to do? And then same thing in graduate school. I think another aspect of all this though was I picked a undergraduate discipline and a graduate discipline that wasn't so steeped or dependent upon origins science. In the sense of molecular biology and bioinformatics, I took biology 101, 102, and that's basically, I guess you could label it introduction to cell biology, introduction to organismal biology. I think the class was actually called organismal biology. And had I gone more of a zoology direction, basic biology direction, learned to be a zookeeper, I would have had a lot more classes on origins and evolution. Core, we're going to teach you evolution type classes, which I think I could have done fine in. Same thing for graduate school. I went into really more medical research than historical origins research. I think I would have, in terms of intellectually, spiritually, been able to do fine. How I could have done academically is another question. What would the schools and professors do if, hey, I don't agree with this, but this is your research type thing. This is the class, and even in the 102 class, organismal biology, I'd say, hey, look, what is the process of evolution, or whatever the question was on the test. I'd say, here's the answer you're looking for. I don't agree with it, but hey, I can put back on the test what you've taught us. I don't know how much they would have tolerated that had had I done that, in upper level undergraduate, even in graduate school. So that was part of it as well. I'd say this whole time. So again, I don't think there was ever a point I wasn't a creationist in the educational process because I'd been taught it and I found it persuasive. The career direction I took was sort of a long, more roundabout story. My initial ambitions going into graduate school were uh, to work on cancer research and eventually get an academic position. I'd actually started off holding to a rather quack position on cancer. I didn't know it at the time, but graduate school was a good education and was able to see, oh, this is how science works. This is how you make a hypothesis. This is how you test it. Here's the evidence for and against it. And so grew into this working on stem cell research as a form of cancer research and was intending to go that direction. And what kind of changed my career path was sort of the spiritual side of things. I began to recognize some of my ambitions were easily contaminated by selfish ambition, kind of just run people over to accomplish things. I'll say Harvard does a good job kind of teaching you to do that. It's not their fault because you can accept it or reject it, but they teach you to be a good, aggressive scientist. I embraced it wholeheartedly, to my detriment. And then along the way, too, I'd say, even though I'd grown up in a Christian home and knew all the Christian answers and core tenets of Christianity, I never felt like it made a difference. Externally, I was always the model child, but internally struggling with sin, with lust and pornography and that sort of thing. And so for me, there was this multi-year struggle of how does believing in Jesus change your life? Because something doesn't seem to be connecting. And it was about the middle of graduate school where the dots really began to connect. I guess you could say I was born again, or really understood how the good news of Christianity. And that got me thinking sort of, are there ways I can apply what I'm doing, or maybe even drop what I'm doing and do something maybe more eternally significant? I considered going into missions and just dropping science altogether. That didn't work out. I thought about going to a Christian college where I could go to seminary. And anyway, it was almost as an afterthought that I applied to the Institute for Creation Research, thinking maybe here's something kind of that fulfills my spiritual ambitions while still applying some of the scientific training I've gained. And I like to say, once a scientist, always a scientist. So everything's an experiment. And my career then, for the past 15 years, has been an experiment to see how this works out. And I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I feel like I've been able to apply a lot of what I learned in graduate school. I feel like I've learned a ton. And even some of my colleagues, so at ICR, I had a colleague who worked in a genomics lab at Clemson for 20 years, big papers on plant genomes and such, plant DNA. And he was saying, even being at ICR, where you rub shoulders with scientists from other disciplines, geology, astronomy, he's like, it just expanded his view of science so much because in the secular academic world, you get very narrowly confined in your department for good reason, because you're trying to collaborate and really press the experiments forward, knowledge forward. And so, what's the latest technology in genomics and so on? You don't necessarily interact much with the geologists and the astronomers and so forth. Whereas it being a smaller institution where I can echo that, uh, it was really helpful to be able to see how science works. And even doing the research I was doing, okay, this is how you make a testable prediction. Uh, I feel like even understanding the basic nature of science took a whole other leap forward for me being at ICR and at AIG, uh, Institute for Creation Research and Answers in Genesis, and have thoroughly enjoyed that side of the endeavor.
And for you, as someone with your science training and your faith, how do you feel about rising technologies with genes, CRISPR, gene editing, in vitro fertilization, these things?
I'd say it depends on the technology. My general default position is skepticism and caution. And in graduate school, so speaking of ethical dilemmas, so one of the big debates, of course, in graduate school was about stem cell research. And there's adult stem cell research, there's embryonic stem cell research. And I've been morally opposed to the embryonic stem cell research. I have almost a bit of a unique position where I feel like even uh, the typical pro-life position is embryonic stem cell research destroys the embryo. I actually think it kind of suspends life. It's really weird and bizarre the way the technology works, but anyway, it's a whole other discussion. Effectively opposed to it, just like other pro-lifers would be. And we had, I think, an ethics class in graduate school. My my takeaway from the ethics class was these seem to exist to kind of justify whatever the scientists were doing. That's kind of a pessimistic view of things, but there was some really bizarre stuff happening, and there did not seem to be a lot of self-control about maybe we should think about side effects. And let me just pick a different topic
And
that's
could I just
perhaps
clarify one
less,
thing?
yeah,
So you're saying the ethics seminars and things seemed just there to put an ethical argument behind what was already happening?
that was my takeaway. That's a pretty harsh condemnation, but I'm like, that's what I
Okay.
witnessed.
Okay.
There was
Thank
kind
you.
of poo-pooing of counter arguments, and I'm like, there's legit. You don't have to be a Christian. There's legit concerns here, and maybe a better example, just to put that one aside for a minute. Let's talk about. And I worked in a plant lab, basically single-celled algae, trying to understand photosynthesis as an undergraduate. And one of the debates there, of course, is with genomically or genetically modified foods. So there's much less emotional height in terms of life and death decisions, but there's still I'm like, there's legitimate scientific concerns here. I'm all for let's advance our knowledge about the world, make the world run better. But I'm like, how do you know there's not side effects from modifying the genome? Again, just look at the human genome for an example. When it was first came out, first published in 2001, it was loudly proclaimed that about, I don't know, 95% of our DNA looked like it was just junk, leftovers from evolution. Then 2012, the initial results from the ENCODE project, that was an acronym, I forget what it stood for, but it basically investigating the function of DNA in humans, showed that about 80% of the human DNA had preliminary biochemical evidence for function, which it was setting a trajectory of basically pointing towards the opposite conclusion from what we thought initially. Which I'm like, again, forget any sort of religious presuppositions, any sort of thing. I'm like, just from a pure scientific perspective, we have reversed our view of DNA function almost 180 degrees. And so, what we would have said about, let's say, if we wanted to modify human DNA in 2001 versus what we would say about modifying human DNA in 2012, we would have predicted the side effects here to be something radically different from over here. How can anyone not say there's serious things I think that need to be explored first? Uh, Yet the general trend seemed to be we're just going to rush forward. Who cares? Maybe not that bluntly, but effectively, that seemed to be the attitude. Let me give one more somewhat humorous example, but sad. I went to a national plant conference when I was an undergraduate as part of the research I was doing, and got to sit in plenary sessions, breakout sessions. One breakout session, the poor lady, she was working, I think, on soil remediation, or I think modifying plants to help take up mercury or clean up things basically after some sort of spill. Noble, I thought it was a great idea. So she stood up, presented her research, and showed how, let's say it's mercury uptake or some sort of toxic chemical uptake, and that the plant was then binding it, sequestering it, and kind of taking it out of harm's way. Well, some guy gets up and says, "Oh, by the way, there's been new experiments that have been done. Not sure you're aware of it, but it actually has the opposite effect, and it's releasing it in a more toxic way. Basically, she's probably been exposed to all this now during this research." And so the moderator, kind of tongue in cheek, says, "Thank you very much. Anyone else have any questions for our presenter before she collapses?" Excuse me, a morbid joke, but there's an example of science changes pretty rapidly, and there's going to be pretty big consequences. And let's just keep going. I'm like, that's foolish. And then there could be real life and death decisions because we don't know what the side effects are. And that's not to be Debbie Downer. It's just, yes, I understand that I'm going to approach many ethical arguments from a Christian perspective with these sorts of presuppositions, and I acknowledge those. But I'm like, even if we put those aside, there's real, legitimate scientific precedent saying you should slow this down. Yes, these are interesting things to explore. Again, there's a whole lot. There's all sorts of other ethical questions to discuss, and each one I think has its own concerns to raise. Some of them moral, some of them scientific. All that to say, even from a pure scientific perspective, rushing into things the way we have been, I think, is dangerous. And we're now at a stage, which let's take COVID as an example. If you do things biologically, boom, you can immediately affect the entire world. So, not to get our podcast censored about COVID, but I feel like I think the current consensus is recognizing it probably came from a Chinese lab, and the point being, if we accept that as the premise, that went global real fast. We have the power to do things at a scale and with consequences that seem unprecedented in history, human history. So to not put the brakes on this and to just rush recklessly forward seems about as foolish as it can be, which I'd like to think scientists, Christian or non-Christian, still have a conscience. At some point, you're going to be like, I think we talked even before we started recording. I had briefly flirted with the idea of doing science in the military, but the direction they were kind of pushing me was, or where it seemed to be going, which of course, once you're in it, you can't talk about it. It seemed to be sort of the biological side. I'm like, that could be bioweapons, and I don't know that I could sleep at night, depending on what they're asking me to do, and I don't know if I'll have a choice. And so I'm like, surely someone's going to say, wait a minute, this could turn out really bad, and I'm not going to be able to live with myself if I go down this path. I'd like to think that, but there's also plenty of evidence to the contrary saying people don't care and just straight ahead. So
Sure.
I have very big concerns about what's coming.
Hmm. Anything particular regarding things like CRISPR?
I think the first thing that comes to mind there is, again, side effects, because we don't know, there's still so much we don't know about where it's inserted. Maybe I should caveat this. If there was some way where you could say, okay, here's a particular gene, and I think there's examples like cystic fibrosis, you can pinpoint, here's the exact genetic problem. Sickle cell anemia, here's the exact genetic problem. And if there was some way to go in and simply change that back, that seems like, in theory, that would be good and inconsequential in terms of negative consequences. Of course, many great consequences, benefits health for the patient. But there also seems to be this X factor of what are the side effects? Are there off-target effects? And let me give one example from a field that was closer to me in graduate school. The embryonic stem cell field almost was resolving itself ethically on its own for purely scientific reasons. So here's an example of you got to make sure you're 100% sure of something, just like CRISPR. With embryonic stem cell research, the power or the double-edged sword nature of it was the embryonic stem cells, in theory, could produce any cell of the body. So if you could produce an embryonic stem cell, or you could clone yourself, that was really the idea. You could make a clone of yourself so that there's an immunological match, harvest those embryonic stem cells, and then differentiate them. So take these undifferentiated cells that could produce anything and make neurons or make pancreatic cells or make, whatever it is that you need for a Parkinson's or diabetes or sickle cell patient. The danger is, what if you don't convert those cells at 100% efficiency? 100% 0.000, no, absolutely every single last cell. The danger is you inject 99.99999% pure neurons or pancreatic cells or whatever it is, and there's a single leftover embryonic stem cell. You might cure the patient's disease and then kill them with a tumor. So the embryonic stem cells form teratomas. They can form anything.
Hmm.
That's the benefit and the drawback. So even the scientific community recognized we're playing with fire here. And what won the Nobel Prize, I think, was actually that's not the best example. I was going to say it was induced pluripotent stem cells, where they kind of took adult cells and dialed the clock backwards. But even the community was recognizing it's probably better if we don't take adult stem cells and dial the clock back to embryonic. It would be nice if we could simply take, let's say, a blood sample from a diabetes patient and simply cross convert it directly into pancreatic cells so that there's no intermediate embryonic step. There's just, you've got either blood cells or you've got pancreatic cells. And so what if we're 95% efficient? Who cares if he's got a few extra blood cells in his pancreas? It's not going to kill him. Whereas a single embryonic stem cell might. That's that's what comes to my mind when I think of, well, what about CRISPR? I'm like, well, can you first of all demonstrate that it specifically targets only what you're looking for? And then secondly, how do you know it's 100% efficient? Because there's already examples, for example, embryonic stem cell research, where the consequences of not being perfect, basically, which is a tall standard, can be disastrous.
Hmm. You have this skill for seeing the logic and the way that people would poke holes in arguments and things. I wonder, what's the strongest argument you've heard for evolution?
That's a good question. Uh, and it may be tougher to answer because I grew up, I feel like, hearing such strong counter arguments to it where it made it laughable. And let me back up and tell another story here. So this year is the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial. One of the discoveries I made this year is we've basically had round two of this, but almost in reverse. So here's, I guess, my retrospective justification for my growing up attitude. Let's ask the question back in 1925, what was the purpose of the Scopes trial? You had a Tennessee law that prohibited teaching evolution. They got a guy, John Scopes, to teach evolution, to deliberately violate the law so they could have this court case. Why? Because they didn't overturn the law. They asked for a guilty verdict. The point, I think, was to mock the law relentlessly. It was nationally broadcast via radio, and I think they were very effective in accomplishing that goal, and it had tremendous consequences. Yes, it caused some of the textbook publishers to back away from pushing evolution, but it also caused many of the Christian community to also kind of retreat. And over the next several decades, the evolutionary community relentlessly eroded the legal foundation for things like the Tennessee law, so that in the 1960s, they overturned, well, Tennessee legislature then rescinded it, I think, in the 60s, and then about it, probably seeing the writing on the wall because a year later the Supreme Court overturned a similar, I don't remember if it was Arkansas, but there was another anti-evolution law. So they were ultimately successful, and it began with kind of knocking down the anti-evolution sentiment in public and doing so very well. 1970s for me is Scopes 2, where people like Henry Morris, Duane Gish are knocking down evolution in public. And they say explicitly, they were basically all anti-evolutionary arguments. It wasn't this strong pro young earth creation. Here's the research and here's the case. It's here's all the holes in evolution. And even though I think they were pretty polite and professional in their presentations, but it was effectively mocking, scientific mocking of the other side, and effective. They lost the court cases in the 80s, kicked creation science out. But that's what I grew up with. I remember seeing a lecture, VHS tapes, born 1980, so Beta, VHS, all that, grew up with that. Some guy can basically give 15 points about why the evolutionary origin of life was impossible. You have to get the right chemicals in the right place, in the right time, in the right condition. I mean, by the time you got to point four, you're kind of laughing. And that's not because the evolutionists are dumb, as much as I'm like, this is crazy. This argument is full of holes. So I had a very strong, hey, here's the case against evolution growing up. And I feel like it was very persuasive. And I don't remember any point at which I thought, maybe I need to rethink creationism because of this evidence for evolution. In my experience with colleagues in graduate school, let's say, or undergraduates, is nearly all of them are unprepared to deal with creation science. They don't even know what creation scientists believe. They're not even prepared to deal with the arguments I make, let alone arguments against evolution. What my research over the last 15 years has been is kind of, I guess, that next phase of Scopes. So after the evolutionists lost the trial in 1925, it was a progressive, relentless chipping away at the legal foundation. Same thing has been happening over the last 40 years in creation science. And that's kind of been what I've been working on the last 15 years, is not putting prayer in schools or religion in science classes as much as the courts said creation science can't be taught because it's not science. It doesn't make predictions that future experiments can be revealed to be true or false. That's what I've pursued. So replacing Darwin is a deliberately chosen title and pursuit because my goal was not to rebut Darwin. I feel like that's been done a lot. That's what I grew up with. It's no, the courts have said you have to come up with something better to replace it, to put in its place if you want to be considered scientifically legit. And I think we've accomplished that and objectively met those goals. And what's been wild for me is, so largely the scientific community has just ignored what people like me and others have done. There's a handful of those who are critics. And I would say early on, and even after Replacing Darwin came out 2017, early in the process, don't have a ton of data. There's still plenty of uncertainty, and I was somewhat nervous. There was a critic or two who posted stuff on the book, and I thought, no, I think I'm still right. I don't think he's dealt with what I've said. But as the research has kept going, and I've seen predictions fulfilled, for example, Traced came out 2022. That's actually fulfillment of predictions I made in Replacing Darwin. And in the process of doing the research for it, this is basically a DNA study of the globe. Can we see the history of civilization stamped in human DNA? At some point, I had data for large chunks of the globe. I did not have data for North Africa. Study came out with North African DNA, and sort of, here we go. What am I going to find? Are the predictions going to work? They did. And at that point, it was a big sigh of relief, like, this is working. We're on the right track. That's not a getting arrogant and we can rest on our laurels as much as I'm like, I've seen this tested and tried. There's certain things I'm sure we'll modify over time, but the big picture framework has been very productive and very precise. And I could almost shrug off what the critics were saying because now the whole debate changed from it wasn't me trying to poke holes in evolution and seeing what their counter argument would be. I could basically play their role now. Whatever they'd say against me, I'd say, well, sure, find whatever holds you want to, but give me something better. Please explain why my model is working, whatever criticisms you come up with. And the craziest thing that happened was there was a PhD guy at Rutgers who's been trying to criticize creationists for some time, responded to Traced, and his main argument was Traced was wrong because it disagreed with the textbooks. And I thought, this is a complete reversal. We've come full circle now. This guy is basically acting like he has a holy book that no one can question, which is exactly what they've accused creationists of doing for umpteen years. And anyway, it was, to me, it was a great gift because I'm like, creationists have talked about evolutionists being evolution being a religion. And I don't know that I've said it as much myself because I'm like, well, they make a lot of scientific arguments. And here was an example of, oh, I didn't even ask for that, but you're basically treating evolution like a religion that can't be questioned. This marks the dawn of something new. And if that's the best he can come up with, I thought, good grief, we must be on the right track. Again, science is always uncertain and things can change, but I thought, you're one of the few people noticing, you're a PhD, you've staked your claim here, and you went there. And you're basically giving credence to some of the strongest objections to evolution without me even making the case. So that's a long-winded way of saying of I don't know that I've seen much in the way of persuasive. That's not to say, and I have colleagues. We've got a guy on staff who was an evolutionist and used to teach it, and ran into creationists who say, that I've found it persuasive. It's not to knock any of that. It's just I grew up being taught evolution and its holds, and it always struck me as this is wild. Uh, it even if we can't teach creation science, I mean, there's so many big hurdles to it scientifically. I don't see how you can convince me otherwise. So again, this is not because I think I'm some sort of intellectual giant as much as I was exposed to it and not prohibited from seeing it, and I found the case very compelling.
Well, before I ask my last question, for people who want to know more about what you're up to, where should they look for you online?
So I work for Answers in Genesis, and if you go to answersingenesis.org, you can find, I think it's a speaker page. Just Google my name. You'll get lists of articles I've written, books I've written. I'm trying to create a project page for what I'm working on right now. It's not done yet, just to kind of collect a bunch of things because there's stuff on the website, articles and books I've written and people can purchase, preview. I've also done a lot of work on YouTube. This really kind of began around the COVID era, where everyone inside and well, what do we do? Well, I guess we go online, and it's just grown and kind of been a great barometer for what questions are people asking and what are the biggest needs and what really sings and so on. And so a lot of work done there, and I feel like there's been an audience that's grown there. People have gotten in touch with me that way. There's a whole Native American research side and doors have been open to non-Christian Native American communities that I never thought would want to have anything to do with us, but because the research is working and affirming some of their indigenous histories, returning dignity and value to them, there's been all sorts of that's been happening. So the Answers in Genesis YouTube page is another place to go where I've got a lot of content there as well. I am on social media with Facebook and Twitter or X and a lot of the other smaller sites, but uh, all that's a place to follow me and I treat the pages basically for correspondence, those social media pages, people ask questions, and just to kind of keep people up on the news of what I'm doing. I don't post a ton. It's, hey, article came out, video came out. That's kind of the purpose for those pages.
Great. We'll put some links in the description for people to check out. And lastly, what would you like people to know about your newest work with They Had Names, the Native American research, that kind of thing?
I'd say this is, I was going to say the beginning, but it's part of what's already begun of a new phase of creation science. It is it's almost a how should I put it? It's non-polemic in the sense of if you think about replacing Darwin, that's an explicitly we're dealing with evolution and creation, and here's why I think I'm right, and here's why I think creation science is making advances. It still is in that spirit of go make predictions, go do detective work, basically, go find a case and try to solve it. Traced represents predictions that were fulfilled, predictions I made in replacing Darwin. That's a global history of the planet. What they had names for me is, in a sense, in terms of this wider apologetic creation evolution debate, is, and I should explain the analogy. I feel like it's helpful to think of what the courts decreed in these detective terms. Or let me back up and try to re-explain the history. In the 1970s, where there were lots of cases in some of the content I grew up with against evolution, to me that was essentially lawyer work. Evolutionists would present their case, creationists would come along and rigorously cross-examine it. I feel like it was effective. It was persuasive to people like me. The court said that's not enough. You basically have to go be a detective, go find a case, solve it, generate your own data. You can't just sit here and criticize. Fine. That's what I've been trying to do. And that's really what this latest book, They Had Names, Pre-Columbian History of North America, represents, where I grew up knowing nothing about it. And I don't think it's because I was in homeschool and Christian school. I mean, I was just down in South America and talking to an indigenous Amazonian who was working for the government in Indigenista, uh, works at the Indigenous Peoples Memorial now in downtown Brasilia. Anyway, so I said, "You're indigenous? What did you grow up learning about your pre-European past?" Nothing. So I think this is true up and down the Americas. Some exceptions maybe being in Peru and Mexico with Incas and Aztecs, but that's, I would say, basically a cold case in detective terms for the scientific community. No one's really solved it. And applying the young Earth creation time frame, uh, there's a whole bunch of clues that have come together to reveal a narrative, confirmed indigenous histories. It's 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 one of the best examples, I would say, of we're now just doing science and taking the lead. That sounds like patting on the back, and my point is not to do that as much as I think I can objectively say this represents one of the best examples of we're in this new era where we've met the court standard. And some of the ancillary consequences of meeting the court standard is, hey, if you do science and you make predictions and they work, you make news, you make discoveries, and that breaks through a dam that I don't think anyone can stop because people sit up and pay attention. That's been my experience on YouTube, where people will contact me and say, "Yeah, I don't like that Bible stuff, but I think you're onto something." So it's catching the attention of people who I think ordinarily would have nothing to do with us. And I think that's just what happens once you start doing science and the science works. So that's what that book is all about. That research is continuing. I'll hopefully have another book on Central America in 2027, and then maybe South America and the Amazon thereafter. But we're still going headlong in that direction, and probably will be for some time to come.
Well, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, for doing that work, for taking the time to do this interview with me, thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.